My name is Nick Freestone, and I'm an education lead for the Physiological Society. It's my great pleasure to be introducing today's webinar entitled, What and How Do Students Learn Without Classroom Attendance? Lessons from Lockdown. Our speakers today will be Christine Kauffman, Prem Kumar, and Harry Witchel. Today's webinar is meant to be quite informal, so you will have a chance to reflect on your own experiences in education, as well as to ask any questions that will be raised by these mini talks, which I'm sure will be very interesting and quite provocative. First, though, a message from our hosts and sponsors of Physiological Society, the Learned Society, set up in 1876. It's very interested in how physiology has advanced through research and the dissemination of physiology to the wider public, but it is also keenly interested in how physiology is taught to the next generation in schools, colleges, and universities. The various themes and information to join the Society will be available at the end of the session. The topic of today's webinar is quite relevant to the COVID crisis. What and how do students learn without classroom attendance? Lessons from lockdown. As I'm sure many of you have been very concerned about this topic because of the current situation. Many of us are probably wondering if higher education will ever be the same again once the lockdown ends. This may be the beginning of more fundamental changes in the HE landscape, or it may just be a stimulus to improve our online and blended learning approaches. This topic then is not just a response to COVID. The development of educational technologies, especially lecture capture, has meant that for the past 10 years, many educators and researchers, as well as many students, have asked, do students really need to be in the classroom? And if so, what do they need to be there for? So to begin, we're launching a brief poll for a minute, just to get an idea of how you in the audience have found things up to this point. Caitlin, the poll, please. So I hope you can see the questions there, and I shall read them out for you. During the peak time of your teaching, approximately how many hours of contact do you teach per week? 0 hours, 1 to 3 hours, 4 to 9 hours, or 10 plus hours? If you could answer that question now, please. The second question is, how have you found the experience of online teaching during the COVID crisis? First option is, I'm not teaching during the lockdown. I have found it very easy is the second option. Technically challenging, and I'm not sure how my students are doing. If you'd like to answer that question now, please. And I think Caitlin, once all the responses in, will be able to share the outcome of that poll for us. So we may come to that, and we'll give you the results from that poll at the end of the session. So that brings us to our webinar proper. Our first speaker, Christine Kauffman, has been conducting educational research asking exactly those kind of questions that we've just answered ourselves. Do students really need to be in the classroom to learn? Our second speaker, Prem Kumar, will be giving explicit examples of what can be happening in both the classroom and online that makes the live experience productive and valuable for the student. Our final speaker, Harry Witchel, will show how adaptive teaching and skills learning can happen online, and how different sizes and types of cohorts require different approaches. In terms of housekeeping, each speaker will speak for about 7 minutes, and after each speaker there will be 5 minutes for questions, where all the speakers will be together to answer your questions. There are 2 ways for you to interact with us today. At the bottom of your screen there is a Q&A function, and you can type in a question at any time during or after the talks. If you could type in your name and institution, I will announce it before your question. But if you prefer to be anonymous, just write anonymous at the beginning of your question, and I'll just read the question without your name. There's also a chat function, which many of you will be used to by now, and this is for you to meet and chat with like-minded colleagues. I'll be reading the questions and monitoring the chat room as best as I can. I don't know how many questions will be asked, so I cannot guarantee that I will read out all your questions. But I'll ask as many of your questions as I can. So I politely ask the speakers to be brief in their answers, please. And I'll limit each response from each of the speakers to 45 seconds. With that, I would like to introduce Dr. Christine Kauffman from the University of Central Florida. Christine's a pediatrician who teaches postgraduate medical students, and we shall hear about her research on that topic, which has been published in Advances in Physiology Education, amongst other journals. Christine, please.
Thank you for having me. And I became interested in attendance and performance because when I started at the University of Central Florida about 8 years ago, we were a relatively new program with an increasing class size. So we had about 50% the class size that we do now. And it seems as though that there are more students in the classroom back then than there are now when we have twice the class size. And it seemed to us that it was our smartest, most well-performing students that were in the classroom with us. So we wanted to study it and get real data that showed that those were the students that were doing well, so we could better encourage our students to attend. So I began to research it. And I think instead what I did was prove myself wrong. To give you a little bit of context, the US medical education system is a graduate entry program. So our students are a little bit older. They're on average 24 years of age. It's a 4-year program. The first 2 years, which is where I primarily teach, are your foundational basic sciences. And this is going to be, primarily in the classroom with various pedagogies, so including lecture, small group learning, team-based learning, simulations, and the like. The vast majority of those sessions, though, do not have mandatory attendance. And for those sessions that don't, the materials are available online. So either recorded if they're a lecture, or access to the small group cases if that was the case. The second 2 years are primarily clinical, and all attendance is mandatory there. The other thing that we have is the United States Medical Licensing Exam. This is a nationally based exam that comes in 4 parts, and it's required for a license in any state in the nation. But also the first part of that is specifically on those foundational basic sciences from that first part of the program. And it produces a 3-digit score, which is used to rank students for the very highly competitive stage of specialty selection. So as a result of that, it's incredibly high stakes for our students. And this has led to quite a robust informal curriculum developing around that licensing exam. And this is just a small example of what's available out there, commercial third-party resources that are quite high quality, that the students are using quite vociferously. As a result of this, they have thousands upon thousands of practice questions that they are going through and using to help prepare for this exam. And this informal curriculum competes with the formal curriculum that we have in hand. So that's sort of the context and the background in which I did my studies. So what did we find? So when we looked at one of our second-year courses and tested for attendance and performance, what we saw was that there was essentially no correlation with how much time the students spent in the classroom and how they did on the exam. If you look, you can see that there was actually quite a large number of students who actually didn't attend any of the non-mandatory sessions. And yet we saw performance levels across the continuum of attendance levels. This was for one of our own internal exams, but also we saw the same thing if we compared this attendance to that national licensing exam. Really no correlation between how much time they spent in the classroom and how much time and how well they did on either of these tests. Now these are knowledge-based exams. The intention is for these to be vignettes that require application of knowledge, but in essence, what we're assessing on these examinations is the knowledge themselves. So it seemed as though, based on this, that the students didn't need to actually have their bottoms in the seat and get the information in front of us to do well on the exam. So what were they doing if they weren't in the classroom? So we looked at how else they were assessing the formal curriculum, at least. Were they accessing the materials online? Were they watching the videos that were being presented? And we combined that together into a single metric, and we called it curriculum consumption. And we found the same thing. Essentially, there was no correlation between how much of this material they used and how well they did on the step 1 or on our internal exams. But what we did notice was, again, that the vast majority of the students were actually using all of our materials. They just weren't doing it in front of us. So this was one course in our second year. So we wanted to expand this to include the entire preclinical curriculum, as well as to start looking at other things. So if we could say that performance on knowledge-based assessments really wasn't affected by by attendance? How about wellness, social isolation, loneliness? How about their performance in a clinical arena? So their performance-based assessments, and later on when they're in the clinical environment. So we started a study, and it's currently ongoing, and to see how much attendance in our formal curriculum affected these other outcomes. And then COVID happened. And now all of a sudden our students, whether they chose to be attenders or not, are all now non-attenders, because that is what everyone is. So we had one course that was essentially split in half by COVID. So the first half, the students were participating in the curriculum as they would. And for the second half, everything was online. They used the pre-recorded lectures from the year before and posted those. The small group case material was again available online. And they did have some Zoom interaction for those small group cases. So we had some preliminary data that's coming from that. The basic mean on that exam from that course was the same as it was the year before, and so was the failure rate. We looked at our study group, and again, we saw something very similar. So the attendance is the attendance rate from the first half of that course when they had an opportunity to choose whether to attend or not. And the performance was on that final exam after the whole course was over. And again, no correlation between attendance and performance. And so our first thought was, well, what was going to happen to those students who wanted to be attenders and now all of a sudden can't? And it didn't seem to make a difference. Those students performed just as well within the module when they were forced to be non-attenders as they did when they were attenders. So far, again, we have a lot more data to go through and assess, and so a lot more will come from this. But our preliminary thoughts is that, again, attendance does not, on a knowledge-based assessment at least, does not matter for performance. Now, in the end, I'm not trying to train people to be good on multiple choice knowledge-based exams. That's not the result that I'm looking for. I'm trying to train physicians and people that are going to take care of other individuals. And so what we now need to look into is the things that we're not truly assessing with these things. We're not assessing transfer of knowledge to patient care. We're not assessing how this is being with these metrics, and we're not assessing really critical reasoning. So we need to look at those and see how this interaction with human beings affects their ability to interact with human beings later and transfer this knowledge to our patients. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine. Very interesting. So we have a number of questions already. We've got 5 minutes, and I guess all the panelists can answer this. One of the first questions was somebody who wanted to remain anonymous, and they asked, was there a correlation in your data with mandatory attendance?
Well, mandatory attendance in our program has been pretty universal. So we pretty much have 100% attendance at the mandatory sessions, with very few students who are out ill for one reason or another. So we did not do a correlation with it, since it was, in fact, everyone went to it.
That's a question I posed on the chat, because I said that most university lecturers in the UK could probably produce a nice linear plot of attendance, especially at workshops, with exam attainment. I'm just wondering if that's down to the different student profiles.
Well, I mean, from our setting, again, remember the material is available online. And so they don't have to attend the session in order to get the material. And that was where we saw, when we did the literature review, studies that had a similar outcome as us had a similar pattern. The material was available online regardless of whether you attended or not. Whereas programs where you couldn't get the material, or it was a performance-based assessment, those more likely had evidence of attendance and performance linking together.
So there was a similar question from Professor Chris Howarth from the University of Arab Emirates about mandatory versus optional attendance. So you were only just looking at the optional aspects in terms of the correlations with attainment.
That's correct.
So another anonymous question, it was quite an important one, I thought, was about the relation of gender to attendance. Do you see any gender biases in those who attend and those who don't?
I will admit, with this particular study, we did not look at that. We are collecting that data for the current ongoing study, and I haven't had a chance to analyze it yet. So I don't know for our particular cohort. So
I guess you could unpack that to a variety of situations in terms of the cohort's demographics, couldn't you? Age, income bracket, background, ethnicity. So there's a huge amount of data one could potentially dig out from your kind of study.
That's true. And we'll be doing that with this current cohort, but we didn't with the last.
Lovely. So I think that's the end of the questions. Oh, somebody's just posted up quickly. We find that our students lack people skills if they haven't attended those sessions. So it's like a behavioral modification procedure in the lectures.
Well, that was my primary goal for this particular one. I will admit I'm more interested in what's going to happen in our second year when our students are having to apply this information in a clinical reasoning environment. They probably won't be attending at the beginning of the year because we're going to be all on lockdown still. So that part of my study may not go as well, but hopefully we'll be able to connect what happened in the first part of the first year with that later on. Thank
you very much, Christine. Very, very entertaining talk. Very interesting. Thank you. So we can now turn to Professor Prem Kumar, who's our next speaker. Thank you. Prem?
Just see if I can share this screen. Where's it gone? Sharing is paused. Please bring your... Let me just share my screen. Hold on. There and there. Why is it? It says... Can you see my screen? Nick? Nick, can you see my PowerPoint screen? Can you hear me?
Chat function up. Yes, it's there now, Prem.
Brilliant. Apologies for that, folks. This is my first time. Right, let me get going. All right, nice to meet you all. It's a lot of you. With the undeniable upsurge of scientific research, we cannot continue to rely on the mere fact that we have learned how to teach what is known. We must learn to teach the best attitude to what is not yet known. Who said this? No, it's not a statement from SAGE, the Government Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies in response to COVID-19, and nor is it a response from our Office for Students in response to the crisis. No, instead, it's a quote from Charles Scott Sherrington, and he made this quote over 100 years ago. And so 100 years later or so, I thought, you know what, I better change what I do. But it wasn't the wise words of Sherrington that made me change, really. It was 6 much simpler words, really, and 6 words that we've all heard and fill us with dread. Do I need to know this? These are the words that at the end of a lecture that you've given that just fill you with dread. The only answer really to this must be, it depends. Anyway, let's try something. Here's a lyric from a song I hope you all know and know well. Here's a clue for you musically. Yep, it's from Smells Like Teen Spirit from the 1991 Nirvana album, Nevermind. This song topped a list of 50 most iconic songs of all time. Smells Like Teen Spirit right there at the top. And this list, probably you wouldn't disagree with much, produced by an algorithm. It probably could have done with a bit more Radiohead or maybe some Joy Division, but what the heck, it's how it is. Okay, let's have a test. Here's our test. Question 1. How many of those songs do you think you could sing along to? Question 2. How many do you think you could sing off by heart? Now, I'm guessing that your answer to number 1 should be considerably higher than your answer to number 2. And that is because question 1 is just asking you about familiarity, whereas question 2 is asking about understanding. We are all, as educators, trying to get our students moving from familiarity to understanding. In pedagogic terms, we're moving from simply received knowledge to constructed knowledge. We expect our students to become knowledge creators after they leave us. What can we do to help our students develop that constructive knowledge? And don't forget, they've got to learn other graduate attributes as well, as Christine just mentioned. Here's just a list of them. Learning is just one of a multiple number of attributes. Where do they get them from? And can we help them? The simple answer is yes, we can. Of course we can. That is our job. But not like this. It isn't good enough to stand in front of them and just reel off list after list of things, with many of them not interested, perhaps not even as interested as we are, or perhaps less so than we are. And this is the heart of it, the teacher-learner conundrum. And we need to solve this so that it stops becoming a them versus us situation, with us looking to get the most learning out of them as possible, often in the most efficient way, and for them to use every trick they have in the book to try and get through this as best they can. Or in the words of Susan Blum, we have to move away from an industrialized model of a predetermined teacher-centric curriculum that's measured by time in seat and high-stakes testing. The risk if we don't do that is high, and that risk is that success, not learning, becomes the goal. And that success is for our students, that's what they believe, as well as for many of our staff who believe that it's about their success that is measured by their student feedback. The question then is, Are we parents or are we just the hired help? I'm hoping there's about 200 voices out there now shouting parents. If not, I'm in trouble. Rogers wrote that true learning must have meaning, feeling, and relevance. And he ascribed a scale to this, the scale going from 0 to 1. 0, where learning has no meaning, no feeling, and no relevance. He gave an example of learning, for instance, on syllables. I'm sure you can think of some examples for that yourself. 1, true learning with all meaning, feeling, and relevance. He gave an example of a child learning that a radiator can be very, very hot indeed. Learning with meaning, feeling, and relevance. Our job is to move our students towards 1. That is, shifting them from being mere consumers of education, shopping down those aisles that we give them, to becoming pilgrims, working hard on a journey of learning throughout their life. Can we do this? Yes, but things have to change. Our students need to change their expectations, and we need to change how we teach them. And the way to do this is to use active learning. I've been flipping my teaching for well over 10 years now. It works. It leads to more effective learning. It leads to better retention of information, and it gives them better performance in assessments. So we certainly should be asking, not telling, in the STEM classroom. We need to future-proof our curriculum, the content and the delivery to account for this change. We need to move from an emphasis on research content to an emphasis on research processes and problems to make our students aware of the future. We need, therefore, to shift from a teacher-focused students as audience approach to one where students are participants. In short, we need to move from the red circle on the left towards the right-hand side of this graph. The bus for this is already on its way, and you should be on it. If you're not on it, you probably want to get on it as soon as you can, get a ticket. But that does not mean that lectures should be simply streamed and consumed passively by our students as if they were just another egocentric TED talk, as Suzanne Moore, the Guardian columnist, said. Active learning works. It increases student performance. It's been well documented now. And this paper was so important that a real hero of mine, Eric Mazur at Harvard, said that it's now almost unethical to be lecturing if we've seen this data. Lecturing is outmoded, outdated, and inefficient. And this paper was submitted in 2013. So what's stopping us from taking this on? The evidence is there. Quite clearly, it's Newton's first law, sometimes known as the law of inertia. An object will remain at rest or in uniform motion in a straight line unless acted upon by an external force. We simply have not had an external force to make sufficient numbers of us change the way we deliver teaching since medieval times. But we do now have an external force. That external force has been forced on us, and it has led to the closure of our classrooms. Now is an opportunity for us to make the changes that are required to future-proof our curriculum and to ensure our students have the tools required for a very unsure future. But this is not going to be easy. And the evidence states how difficult this will be. In 2019, this paper came out. Let me just read you this bit here. Students in active classrooms learn more, as would be expected based on prior research, from active learning, but their perception of learning, while positive, was lower than that of their peers in the passive environments. This suggests that attempts to evaluate instruction based on students' perceptions of learning could inadvertently promote inferior or passive pedagogical methods. Students have a very poor feeling of learning when they are sensing that they're having to work particularly hard. This is something we will all have to work hard to overcome and help our students understand that that is the learning process. It's not going to be easy. And here's a quote from Thomas Edison: "We often miss opportunity because it's dressed in overalls and it looks like work." More eloquently, here's Willie Nelson: "Nobody said it was going to be easy. It's only as hard as it seems. But lately it's harder than usual. Am I dreaming impossible dreams?" I don't think I am. I don't think we are. I think we can do this. So I'll leave you just with one final quote. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prem, for that very entertaining talk. We have a number of questions, and apologies for colleagues if I didn't run through your questions. There was some glitch and I only saw 2 or 3 of them, and then I was deluged with 22 dozen at the last minute. We'll try and answer those questions at the end maybe. So we did have an anonymous comment. Prem said, singing off by heart is not necessarily understanding. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, okay. So it's a facetious example that's there to grab your attention. Had I had more than 7 minutes, I would have built on that premise for you. No, singing off by heart is probably not understanding. But what I meant from that is once you can sing it off by heart, you can then go on to make a cover version of it. You could then relate it and teach it yourself. It's certainly better than singing along to it. So yeah, apologies for the facetiousness of it all. It was an attempt to really just grab attention, and it worked.
Thanks, Prem. So I have a question from Jose Areta, who asks, with this tension between active learning, when we're talking about remote teaching, so how do we balance those two, which might be competing demands, I guess?
I lost a bit of that, Nick. Can you repeat it?
Yeah, the tension that might exist between active learning and active teaching and the online milieu that we're being forced into now, the remote learning.
Okay, so what I would say for that is very simply, give the content via a lecture capture recording. They can take it themselves and then do an online. All of the stuff that I use for active learning, the polling, all the clickers, phones, it's all available online. There is no reason why we cannot run an online poll for questions. So all my active teaching, my flip teaching, is about a Q&A and response and student learning. We can use breakout rooms in Zoom. You can put your students into rooms. They can think about the question. They can come back. They can use the Q&A. They can use the chat. We have so many opportunities to make this even better than in a lecture theatre, I think. So I don't see the tension. I think it's a real opportunity. So
Louise Robson from Sheffield has said that her own research shows around 90% of undergraduate students agree that active learning helps them. How do you think it helps them with their problem solving, though, which is crucial, I think, for science students?
Oh, hi, Louise. Yeah, it does help. Of course it helps. With the flip teaching, the classic way of doing it is to use peer teaching. So you ask a question that is going to cause a different response, a 50-50 response in the cohort, and then they peer teach. That is problem solving. They teach each other how to do it. You can set problems. We can have numerical answers. It's not just MCQs on things like turning technologies teaching. You can set questions. You can set problems. You can ask a question and they can go away. You can come back tomorrow and do it. They can do it tonight and come back tomorrow. We can do anything, Louise. We can set up problems. It shouldn't be passive teaching. We can give that information online. They can do that at 3 in the morning. In fact, many of my students do it at 3 in the morning and then come to the active class later.
So a question from Christopher Tyler. To what extent do you think an active PBL approach can work at university level when this is in stark contrast to the way that students have been prepared for university at schools and college? Much of what we seem to have to do at our level of teaching is to try and unteach students what they've learned from before.
You're not wrong there, Nick. So I teach a first year class, year 1 graduates here, 18, and there is a lot of difficulty initially. I think the secret is to explain why you're doing it, the evidence for it, prove to them that it works by asking them questions, showing them that the shift is there, that it's about confidence, it's about them having a chance to, as I call it, fail safely. They're allowed to have a go. These are all purely formative, and it is a transition. It isn't easy. That's why I use the quotes I used at the end of my talk. It is not easy. It will become easier if more of us adopt it, because I think then they will see that it's the norm. But whilst a list of bullet points is available and the exam question says to name 3 of those bullet points, it becomes a very difficult task. You have to make the assessment fit with the way we're teaching, and we're not doing that. Our assessments are driving the learning that the students then believe is the way that we should be teaching.
Can I add a comment to that?
Yes, Christine.
I just wanted to say, so, you're talking about starting off with your 18-year-old students who are just coming out of their, what we would call high school environment. I'm dealing with students who've already graduated, in some cases already have PhDs. So they have, been through active learning as they've gone through, yet because of the vast quantity of material that we're trying to cram into them in the first 2 years of our program, these students revert back to the just tell me what I need to know. Don't put me in an active learning environment because I just want to be told what I need to know. And I think that becomes as a result of how we're assessing them.
I'll jump in, Christine. Evidence shows that our 18-year-old students who took their A-levels in June can recall less than 15% of that information. So we're cramming. Your medical students by year 5 do not recall 90% of what you, so we are giving them too much information at them. It's up to us. We're the educators. They're going to be strategic in their learning, and their success to them is to pass the exam. You know, where you're going wrong, Dr. Kumar, they told me once, is that you're teaching me to be a better doctor, but I won't be a better doctor until I pass this exam this month. And that's their focus is on the road right in front of them. We're over teaching, we're over assessing.
Oh, I agree 100%.
So I think that brings us on to our final talk. There are a number of questions we can save until the end, if that's all right, colleagues. And now I give you Harry Witchel. Hello, Harry.
Hello, welcome. First of all, big warm welcome to our visitor from Florida, Christine Kauffman, and a warm welcome to all of you, and many thanks also to the Physiological Society and to Chrissy Stokes and Caitlin for organizing this. You've just heard some really important and great stuff on what's going on with lockdown and how do students learn from classroom attendance. And I suppose where I'm starting from is, well, hey, we've arrived. There is no classroom attendance now. I have been worried about this moment for 10 years, wondering once they instituted online recorded lectures, is that the end of universities? Is this going to be just everyone watching lectures from Harvard? What's going to stop students from just watching that? And the answer is, that's the wrong question. Because of course we now know that it's not lectures from Harvard, but in fact, it's all sorts of commercial suppliers. So Christine was mentioning before, all sorts of different suppliers of online learning materials that students like to use that are independent of the university. So this is things like Anki or Palms, UWorld, the list goes on and on. It's really an incredible change that we are dealing with. And I guess the real question is, how are we going to deal with this? And this is based on, essentially, let's take apart the question into two pieces. One is the presence in the classroom, and the other is the synchronous or asynchronous nature. So right now you're not in the same room as me, but there's a synchronous relationship between us because you're getting some sort of feedback. And this is really important to where we're going. So what does the pedagogical literature say about this? And a lot of it is written in Advances in Physiology Education, which is where Christine has published quite a bit of stuff, and also in Proceedings National of Sciences USA. But let's talk about what happens. Let's start with what happens with learning. Now, I'd like to remind you about Hermann von Helmholtz. So Helmholtz was born just about 200 years ago. He invented, I mean, he wasn't just a doctor, he pretty much invented the physiology of music. He essentially made the physiology, he started out the physiology of perception, the psychology of perception. He did all of these incredible things, and yet he didn't have a laptop. He didn't have any of the normal things that we would associate with modern educational technique. How does that work? Well, very simply, because most of education does not happen in the classroom, it happens up here. It's inside the student's head, and that really hasn't changed in all of these years. What has changed, what we've learned from all of this educational research, is the importance of rehearsal of retrieval. Retrieval is the idea that the more often that students retrieve a memory, the more that they bring the memory out of their memory bank, if you like, the more they learn it, the better they are at retrieving it. And that's really what's important. Rather than seeing information, it's retrieving it. And it turns out that they learn more the more effortful this effort is. That is, if you're retrieving information just as you're about to forget it, it reinforces the information more than if you just repeat it 3 or 4 times in a row. But this idea of repetition, you can learn by repetition, but it's not really a very effective way of learning unless you repeat things a lot. And one thing that we have learned is that repeated reading is inefficient. As Prem just pointed out, all it really does is lead to familiarity. So let's talk about this idea of effortless learning, which is really partially a dream. It can be partly true, but it's mostly a dream. Now, think about when you were a child. When you were just about 4 years old, maybe you have children who are about 4 years old now, they start learning all of these things like, what is a tiger? You didn't have to study any of that. You just learned it in one-shot learning. Yet when I'm teaching students about beta blockers and the drug atenolol, they have to study it over and over again, all these different drug names, and they really struggle to learn what it is, just these new words. So I'm not really talking about concepts here. I'm just talking about really basic facts. What is it that allows them to learn? Well, the two things are related to context. That is salience and meaning. Both of these relate to context. Salience is whether the atom of knowledge fits in or sticks out from its background context. And meaning is how that atom of knowledge fits in a sort of in a web with their previous knowledge. So that's what happens in learning. That's what really is important, is this retrieval, salience, and meaning. But what's going on in the classroom? Well, the most important thing, that if there's anything you're going to look, if you remember only one thing I'm saying today, what's really important is about adaptive teaching and learning. So most of you have a lot of experience in the classroom of the idea that there's rapid teacher to student feedback. And this is by far and away the most important thing that happens in a classroom. But it can also happen in synchronous online learning, the way we're doing things now. But it's really difficult to do with large groups of students. So this is one approach, which is information that is both salient and especially meaningful to a student when you give information to the student exactly when they need it. But information goes the other way as well. When students use their confusion and ask for clarification, and when we understand that, then we can adapt to the student's weaknesses. We can actually we can change our lectures. It's not simple, but it's possible for us to change how we teach. And this is all part of the Socratic Q&A, more of the sort of flipped classroom thing that Prem is talking about. But the other major aspect of what's valuable to the classroom is skills learning. So in skills learning, manual skills can be learned on your own in an asynchronous manner, but not really very successfully. It's very difficult to shape that kind of learning. And this goes double for communication skills. With communication skills, really you do need synchronous interaction. Those communication skills might be related, if you like, to social learning. So students need to join a community of practice, and I'm not just talking about in medicine, but also scientists themselves have to join a community of practice. I mean, when we go back to communication skills, when we think about that, not only doctors, but the whole of science, and if we're training professional physiologists and scientists, they need to learn communication skills too. I've just written an entire book on communication skills for physiologists so that they can understand how to communicate successfully at a scientist to scientist level. Oh, there's also peer-to-peer learning, and that's really useful. So as an example, whenever I give student feedback, when I tell students the answers to a test in a classroom session, I stop and after each question, let the students speak for a full minute so that they speak amongst themselves to reinforce their own learning amongst their own friends. It has nothing to do with me. What they're learning from the test, the formative test, is what they learn with their friends and other students. And this is part of the additional social motivation for engagement. All of this is really valuable in terms of what happens in the classroom. Some people also mention liveness. This is things like gestures. So we've all made gestures like acting out what myosin does in a sarcomere, and we also use body language as well, but that's much less important. Please remember adaptive teaching and learning. So what can we do about teaching during COVID? Well, obviously that depends on the student. So as Christine was just telling us, it was really important to remember that the students she's talking about are postgraduate students. They've already been successfully through one entire university career. So those are students which have a high degree of self-efficacy. That's a kind of a fancy way of saying maturity, that they know what they can do, they know what they need to do, and they know how to go about and just get on and do it. They also have high degree of academic reserve. So they're resilient to setbacks and difficulties they might have in academia. These bright and motivated students, obviously we have to curate their information, but really all we really have to do at an adaptive level is answer their questions. Plainly, if you're trying to teach them skills, then that will require adaptive feedback. But what about our more medium students? Well, there, as Prem points out, we really have to add motivation. We have to include activities. There are lots of different activities. I'll show you in a second. So a list where you can get all these activities. And we have to break the tedium of screen time. So what are some resources for educators? Well, you can go to the Life Sciences Teaching Resource Community. That has some really great stuff for students of all ages. And it includes, I mean, for an example, they have a fantastic stuff at the university level for the physiology of respiratory physiology, which is great stuff. So go going to have a check at Life Sciences TRC. You're all familiar with LT from ADI Instruments. They have lots of online learning material. Andy Petzold, great guy. He has recently written in Advances in Physiology Education some really useful, a complete list of everything that might be out there for a jobbing physiology teacher to present to their students. And also there's great advice from Gannon for lessons moving from face-to-face course to online. I'd also like to do a free plug for my recently published book, Writing for Biomedical Sciences Student, which was fortuitously released in the middle of the COVID crisis. Boo-hoo. So that was 2 years of my life wasted. And finally, what about Physiology 2021? Yes, that's right. The next meeting that you can go to in person in 2021 at Birmingham, the city of canals. Prem will be there to welcome you, and Christine and I will be running an education workshop, and we're really keen to get as many people to come in and help to discuss with us and to join the discussion of what it is we need for decision makers and policymakers to take back to government to help decide what the future of education is and what needs to happen in education. And that will be happening between the 12th and 14th of July, 2021. So thank you very much. Hope to see you at Physiology 2021 in Birmingham.
Okay, so I think we have some time for questions, of which there are many. So I shall throw them out in a random order. Bert Bond asked about, I think it was during Christine's talk, asked about the difference between engagement and attendance.
So that's very interesting, and that's the way we looked at it, is that just because you attended didn't mean you weren't engaged with the material. And vice versa, you know, you could be in the room and not engaged. The number of times I've sat in the class, back of the classroom and watched the students buy shoes rather than paying attention to what's on at the front of the room, versus, you know, the student who isn't in the classroom yet highly engaged with the material, just not doing it in front of you. And I think that one of the markers that previous studies were showing, that the students who can't get the material outside of showing them in class, that's definitely a marker for engagement. And the students who weren't attending were not engaged, and therefore it was a sign of problems for that student. Whereas now, because things are so different, so much third-party material, so much lecture capture, those kinds of things, it does not mean a lack of engagement. So I think that's where we need to put our view, is, are those students engaged or not? And that tells us whether or not they're at risk for poor performance.
A lot of this relates back to what they know. So I mean, obviously, in the ancient history, we had viva voce, and we were able to tell just from discussing with students. But it's so much more difficult for us to get those moments where we talk one-on-one to students, especially in some sort of formal interaction. But it's definitely true that now more than ever, we really need a more consistent way of getting feedback from the students, as well as finding out and having, even if it's only formative assessments, we need to monitor those formative assessments to know where the students are, because they're probably getting information from places that we may not have imagined.
My university, all the healthcare professional students have a minimum requirement of attendance, and it's there to help make that link between all those other attributes, you know, the fact that they're going to communicate and work as a team, etc. But really what it does is it drags people who have no interest in being in that room into that room where they don't then engage. And I've seen a number of Excel sheets and templates that you can use to monitor engagement. It could take you the whole lesson just monitoring engagement, whereas an attendance register is just a tick. So I think we do have to move towards an understanding of what engagement means versus attendance. So I understand, Christine, you know, it's easy to measure the attendance, because I guess you would have a perfectly good correlation if you could get engagement against assessment result, but that's not easy.
No.
So there were a number of questions around the specific technological aspects and the emotional aspects of online learning. So Darren James said, how do you prepare students for active learning? Ishmael bin Jalil said, there's technical and emotional barriers to online learning. How do the instructors deal with that? Different ability levels, for instance. Do we have different material for different ability levels? So there's the audience that we're facing, plus the barriers. There may be technological and emotional. Students hiding behind the screen. How do we get them to engage? A plethora of questions around there. I've tried to synthesize them as best I can.
Nick, some of the anecdotal stuff that I'm getting now is that students are engaging, at least in what is a replacement of the small group teaching session, better online than they are in the classroom. There's a certain anonymity We are hearing here at Birmingham that when students are given a choice, they would rather have not their face on the screen, just their name, and then they'll speak, they'll use the chat and so forth. So in a funny kind of way, we may well get greater engagement with this rather than not. And the technology is quite straightforward. And I'll give you one other, not too facetious a comment. I don't know anymore the names of all my students, but with Zoom, I do. I look like a hero. I know all their names written right underneath it, and I can read. So the question was about how do we get them to, we just got to keep working with them, show them how to use it, talk to them. I like the idea of different abilities, different teaching. We can now run multiple approaches. We don't have to have 20 students of different ability in a room. We could run 3 sessions with different levels, and they can come into all of them, none of them, as they wish. I just think personalizing education, like we're personalizing medicine, has to be the way forward.
So then we had a question about the media that one uses, one from Daria Abdulatif and one from Chris Torrens. So what do we use in the place of our lectures, our traditional lectures, and what specific design is there of the learning materials for online purposes? To anybody.
I speak too much, but I'd say I use Proctored, record the lecture, that's online. They can look at it as often as they want, when they want, whatever time. And then in the classroom, use turning technologies and clickers and so forth. There's plenty of approaches. You know, I think we'd have to, and again, as I said on my slides, you know, students as participants, let's ask them, what do they want? We never seem to ask them. They'll just take it passively as trusting us, but let's ask them, how would they like to learn?
So there was a question to Christine at the beginning from Charlotte Haig. The students that you looked at were postgraduate students. Do you have any idea how they learned in their first degree?
No, we don't, because our students are coming such a wide variety of backgrounds. I mean, in the United States, you have to have basic science prerequisites to get in, but you can have a degree in anything. So we've got students who've got journalism degrees. We've got students with degrees in art history. Students who are coming in with this as a second career. So we have a wide variety of students who are getting a wide variety of different backgrounds depending on which undergraduate university that they went to. So we don't actually have a good understanding of what they're doing before, and it's most likely not even remotely the same between our different students.
Anybody else have any observations on any questions that we've thrown up so far?
One of the questions that I saw pop up, it was about material being prepared for online versus not.
Yep.
So I talked about all our materials being available online prior to the COVID, but these weren't intended to be online classroom. We were not building an online curriculum. We were building a face-to-face curriculum. And we said, okay, well, you can watch this lecture online if you would like, rather than truly creating and distributing an online curriculum. And so, you know, at least for the COVID crisis, when our students are no longer actually able to come to the classroom or not, we should probably need to focus more on designing true online materials that are meant to be preserved that way, rather than just saying, okay, here's this lecture that I gave in person one day, and now you can watch it online if you prefer.
So there was one question that caught my eye, and I know we didn't cover that aspect of online learning today, but it was about online assessment. And the question was from Victor Emojevwi. How do we administer online exams?
There is software out there for proctored exams. If you want to do a timed exam, you can do a timed exam and you can have the student there doing it. But if you want to go for, I mean, one of the emergency reactions in the UK to lockdown was that a lot of our students were given open book learning assignments. And that is something that people, I'm sure like Harry and I, have called for years, and people have resisted it. But within a day, we gave all of our students, and they went off and did it. And I don't know that there's anything wrong with that. You know, we checked. I've never been asked as a senior researcher or educator in the last 30 years to write anything without access to any literature, and to do it in pencil with handwriting and not ever correcting it. Why are we training students for that kind of recallability? It's beyond me.
So I do have an answer to Prem, and first of all, of course, I agree with Prem on everything, that's a matter of principle. But, and I also agree that we as scientists, all of us, we live the open book lifestyle. It's absolutely essential that we synthesize information. But the real question is about high stakes exams, which is what happens when we're giving students high stakes exams, and how are we going to deal with that? And the sad truth is that even in a medical school, I won't say which medical school, but I would estimate that a medical school that I might know of has maybe 5 or 10% of students who are bad faith actors. That is, that they might be tempted, if they're not observed or proctored, to otherwise take advantage of an open book situation. It is true that there are these Big Brother-like software where they actually have a camera on the student. And so you're proctoring your student and watching their eyes and watching where their eyes go. And you can tell that. I personally am not ready for that level of intrusion. But it is true, it's a fundamental problem. And it's very sad that, I mean, 90% of our students, that's what I can say, 90% of students are fantastic and don't believe in that.
I mean, in our institution, that's essentially what we did. We used software with lockdown browsers that prevented them from going to other locations on their computer, that did video capture or monitor them with audio and video during the thing. It's not someone continuously staring at you during it. It's, you know, the computer flags what it considers, you know, unusual behavior for review later. You know, but again, if we think about what's happening in our later assessment, so again, as a physician, you know, I have to recertify, you know, periodically. And again, we're doing that exact same thing. These exams, they're timed, you know, but they are essentially open book. We're not trying to keep them as locked down experiences, but because you can't, in a timed environment, you can't look up everything. And in life, you can't look up everything. You have to be able to just know some stuff. But in the end, we do look up stuff all the time. I mean, that it's common, you know, again, with research or in patient care, you know, that at some point I'm going to look something up because I've never seen this thing before, or if there's a new in treatment or something like that, but I can't look up everything. And I think that's the good balance, is this cross between, you know, open book and timed, where, you know, you allow them to do what would be done in normal life.
Nick, I've seen a question on practicals there. And, you know, just to say that, you know, as we ease lockdown and move people back in, we're going to obviously focus on practicals and things like OSCEs that cannot be done online. And I think that, you know, there has to be, we're not the Open University, we're not a distance learning course. We have to have students. There is a community that we have to engage with. But I think the practicals, the communication, all these things need to be brought back in. And so online teaching, what we're going to do with practicals is as much of the pre-learning that we can do can be done online. You know, you can do all the learning online, come into the practical, so it's only that experimental element that you're going to really learn about. And then all the analysis afterwards and the wash up can go back online. So they're in, do the practical and out. And I think using that, we can really maximize the time that students are in a building. And I don't think when we go back to normal, that that's a bad thing anyway. Those pre and post learning elements should be available all the time, not just in that 3-hour slot.
So one more question before I wrap up, and I'll take the liberty of asking that myself. So I recently saw a survey from the US institutions. They surveyed 1,287 students from a range of different types of institutions across the US. And 75% of those students were not satisfied with online learning, and that's in the current situation. So in our preliminary discussions, we said that students like online assessment, but don't like online learning, and lecturers definitely don't like the online learning aspect. But can you comment on that data where students don't seem to be that happy with online learning at the minute?
Means I'm not out of a job.
I mean, it's a combination of things. I mean, these are students who are now also in the lockdown with everybody else. So, you know, they're not able to do anything else besides watch their online materials, whereas before they were doing other things while watching it. So that could be part of it. And also, were those materials truly designed to be online, or are they getting something that was really meant to be done in person, and it's sort of rushed online because it was the only option we had at the time?
Don't give them a 45 to 50, 60-minute lecture online. No one looks like, I can't even watch a film for an hour, never mind me talking about surfactant. So break it up. 7-minute, 5-minute, 3-minute Brits, one learning outcome, one small video, make it like YouTube, they'll watch it. It's going to bore the pants off anybody to have to listen to something for an hour.
Okay, colleagues, I think we need to wrap up then, unless anybody else had any observations. I'd just like to thank our contributors today, Christine Kauffman, Prem Kumar, and Harry Witchel. I'd like to thank the Physiological Society and especially Caitlin Oates for giving us the technological tools to conduct this webinar.